Feeling a little sleepy. When she makes those adenoidal noises, that means she's sleepy. I'm gonna sleep a little. Oh. Hello, BookTube, and welcome to your daily Penguin, your daily Frida sighting. This is our tour through my Penguin Classic wall, book by book, author by author. We've been hitting all sorts of variety, but we've been spending a lot of time in the 19th century American literature, and today's book is no exception. It came out in 1902, but it is very much a product of 19th century American fiction. And this is The Virginian by Owen Wister, and a terrific Penguin Classic. This is edited by John Seeley from not Wister's 1902 version of this book, but the extensive revised version that he made in 1928. Wister was from the East. He was from Philadelphia. But at one point in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, like so many other people from the East, he was advised to take a health cure in the West, in the Wild West, in the untamed Wyoming country. And he went, hoping to shoot big game and rest and relax, and encountered there a dying world. By the 1880s, 1890s, the world of the cowpuncher, the cowboy, the wild, untamed frontier, the endless herds of buffalo, all that sort of stuff, that world was ending. It was more and more being civilized. It was pushing further and further west and north. It was being penned up in curiosity shows like the one put out by Buffalo Bill. It was people who had lived that life were seeing it disappear into obsolescence. Some of you who will remember Charles Portis's great novel True Grit will remember that the main character of that story, Rooster Cogburn, is a towering figure from that era who ends up in a sideshow, literally in a sideshow. And his own short lifespan is long enough to see that change. Everybody who went out west, the most famous example from a literary standpoint would be Francis Parkman, who did the exact same thing, came back and wrote the Oregon Trail. The most famous example in non-literary history would be Theodore Roosevelt, who for a while, for many years of his formative, in his younger life, routinely went west to charge his batteries with the kind of authenticity and directness that he didn't think he could find in the East anywhere. And Owen Wister did the same thing, trying to maneuver the sunlight here. Owen Wister did the same thing. He went out west, and I don't think it cured his health ills. I tend to agree with most people who look into the subject that he didn't have any health ills, that he was just, it was all in his head, it was all psychosomatic. But it did fill him with inspiration to write this book, which is about the quintessential cowboy. This is the mold from which all American cowboys in fiction have been made. It owes as much to Fenimore Cooper and the romances of earlier authors, including even Mark Twain, as it does to anything that Wister saw when he was in Wyoming. But it's still immortal, a quiet, noble man who sets himself against the forces of evil on the fringes of the frontier. That pattern has been imitated a million times since this book came out, and that pattern meant something. It was I know that it's a little bit outrageous to refer to this book as having anything in common with Moby Dick, but I think they're extremely similar. In both cases, the author saw a world, a way of life, a way of seeing the world that was ending, that was obviously short-term, and decided to immortalize it and romanticize it in the process. Now, Wister isn't the writer that Melville is, but he's a better writer than he's usually given credit. You're only ever going to see this book by him, not any of the other books that he wrote, not the big... not the big fat volume of short stories that you could make from this author, not any of the nonfiction work. He is permanently gone, I think, other than this one novel. And this one novel is in the Penguin Classic edition in an example of a kind of Penguin classic that I've mentioned in this tour of the Penguins before, where the edition itself is so perfect that you don't want any other. I would, of course, a part of me would want an oversized illustrated edition of the Virginian. I'm sure that there have been many, but this is the version that I would want in terms of annotation, in terms of Seeley notes the differences right down to the last semicolon between the 1902 version and the 1928 version, and gives a great introduction, great notes. It's just, this is what you come to a Penguin Classic for. And the reason why there was interest enough for Wister to do a 1928 edition of this book is because when it came out in 1902, it was a phenomenal hit, a runaway bestseller. Just copy after copy after copy, printing after printing, edition after edition, everywhere. His life suddenly changed. He had hopes of starting a career in music, and had even written a couple of operas. And he looked with a kind of a moth to flame cupidity at the world of politics, which was being dominated by Theodore Roosevelt, who was not only another American of the 19th century who went west to find renewal, but who was also Wister's friend. They were both in Harvard, the class of 80. And they stayed friends all their life long. Wister also met Remington and was friends with him all lifelong. And it was with this book that suddenly Wister, he had tried a few different avenues of employment, including, as is so often crops up in these author biographies in America, including a stint in a bank, working in a bank. Obviously unsuited to such work. It didn't appeal to him at all. It bored him and irritated him. And with this book, everything about that changed. Suddenly he had a literary figure. Suddenly he had a literary career. Something that had been urged on him for a long time by a person we would have to call his literary mentor, William Dean Howells. And boy, oh boy, when lightning struck, it good and properly struck, because the Virginian was suddenly everywhere. And not just reprinted from that original edition, but a million copyright-free adaptations and swipings, little hardcover picture books, kids' books, comic books, everything. I'd be curious to know what an actual bibliography catalog of this book's life has been. It would be immense. And probably we'll never know the full extent of it. And you can understand why when you read the thing. It's the same reason that made, we tend to forget, but it's the same reason that made Fenimore Cooper's stories bestsellers. The same reason. The mapping of a kind of Arthurian chivalry and code of morality onto the Wild West. And that plus a kind of sentimentality for the Wild West itself as it was fading. There are strong secondary characters in here. There's more or less strong female character in here. And you won't find a serious high opera American Western after this book that doesn't look over its shoulder at this book in some way or other. Usually consciously. Usually the writers in the Western genre, I'm not talking here about the potboiler writers who don't care about anything. I'm talking about the ones who want to write a great Western. They always note this book, nod to it in some way or other, and they can't help but partake of the gimmicks, the cliches that it set in place. There's no way around that. If you don't do that, then you're not, in American eyes, writing a Western at all. As to the recommend part of the Penguin Classic, we once again face the same problem here. This is a great edition of this book. If you want an edition of Owen Wister's The Virginian that tells you everything you need to know about it, or might want to know about it, that are curious about it, this is the edition to get. An amazing bargain for what you get. When this thing first came out, it was $10 as a paperback. And for the amount of scholarship and historical research in here, that is a bargain. You don't need it. My beloved Magnum Easy Eye paperbacks from a million years ago made a paperback of Owen Wister's The Virginian that didn't have even an introduction. It was just the text of the book. And you don't need more than that. Now, the question about the recommendation part comes from the book itself. I definitely recommend this Penguin edition. But I don't know what to do about the book itself. I guess I would strongly recommend it to those of you who are already fans of the Western novel. If you haven't read it, This is where they all come from, so you really should. I've had this book on my mind because I've been making my way through this book. The latest Library of America volume is a volume on the Western, with 4 books in it: The Oxbow Incident, The Searchers, Shane, and Warlock. All 4 of those books are very different. They all look to the Virginian. I've read 2, so I've read Shane and Warlock so far, and they both look to the Virginian explicitly. But I believe, if I remember correctly, that the other 2 at least glance in its direction, drop lines, drop quotations, that sort of thing. So I've had this in mind. It's a good case of perfect timing, because I'm going to read the second 2 books on this thing this week. So I guess that is the nature of my recommend. If you already like American Westerns, and haven't read the granddaddy of them all, then you should, and you will like it. If you haven't read any Westerns at all, oddly enough, I'm not sure that the place to go would be to the text here, the thing that started them all. I'm not sure this would be the one to go to, because it doesn't answer to modern sensibilities much. Whereas you could find a more or less classic Western that was written in the last 30 years that does. And then maybe work your way back to this. I don't know. But one way or another, it was a delight to pull this down. I reread the introduction, and then I read through a huge chunk of passages in here. I'm due for a whole reread of this book, and I don't think it would be the Penguin Classic that I would reread. I'd probably wait. Reader's Digest, I think, did a hardcover edition of this. I could wait until I find that old Magnum Easy Eye paperback again, or maybe even an e-copy. There's probably an e-copy of the Virginian. Utterly unknown to Owen Wister. But he worked the daylights out of this thing. He was a hardworking author. His nonfiction is very much worth reading. He wrote biographies that are still very much worth reading. But he worked the daylights out of this, made it a stage play, was handed heaping piles of money when it was made into a movie, not once, but twice. And it's been going on since then. Since he died, since then, it's been made into movies and TV shows many, many times. It's just a rock-solid template. So it cast a big shadow. I'm glad it's in the Penguin Classic line. I'm just not sure how much of a recommend it has in 2020, all on its own. But I loved revisiting it. So that, even though it's 1902, this thing was conceived and born entirely of the 19th century. It is definitely a product of the 19th century. And the world that Wister captures in here was entirely gone by 1902. So he's lucky that he got there when he got off his train where he did. Anyway, I'm going to wrap up your Penguin for today with Owen Wister's The Virginian. We'll see what we encounter tomorrow. Will we stick around the 19th century and America, or venture far afield? I don't know. This is starting to look to me like I must have organized this shelf at one point. So we could find something like that tomorrow. But in the meantime, I'm gonna wrap this up for now. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.